Hello, today we're going to learn 6 key things about medieval Europe, also called the Middle Ages in Europe. And if we're going by the WAP time periods, this includes the time period 1200 to 1450. So to understand what's going on in medieval Europe, we need to go back and remember what happened last in Europe when we last studied Europe, which was the Roman Empire. So this map shows the invasions of many different tribes into the Roman Empire. The Western Roman Empire fell in part due to those invasions, and the Eastern Roman Empire continued on. The Western Roman Empire fell in 476 CE. And there were many groups that took over, and different kingdoms sprung up in the western part of Europe. So you can see on this map, rather than being united under one empire, the Roman Empire, now it was all divided up. So what did this really mean for the people? Well, there's no longer a strong central authority in Europe. So the protection of Roman laws and the Roman military is gone. The Romans had built a lot of infrastructure, aqueducts, roads. Those are no longer being maintained. And Europeans began to experience new invasions from groups such as the Vikings from Scandinavia, who are in purple on this map. So they came from Scandinavia and invaded all throughout Western Europe. Muslims invaded across the Mediterranean Sea from North Africa. And the Magyars, which are in green, invaded from Eastern Europe. So all of these invasions caused a lot of instability and insecurity in Europe. So if you were a European living at this time, you would probably be very afraid and anxious about any of these invaders coming at any time because you no longer have a strong central government like the Roman Empire. So the problems of these invasions are magnified by the lack of central authority, because if they had been invaded and there had been a strong central government, perhaps the government could have done something about this. But people are just like having to fend for themselves. And so it creates a lot more chaos and anxiety in society. The Vikings in particular also were traders. So even though they invaded, they are responsible for trading and cultural diffusion. So you can see they started in Scandinavia and traded throughout Western Europe and into Russia. Russia was actually settled by Vikings as they came over to trade and eventually settled down. Eventually, the Vikings stopped raiding and started farming and assimilated into society. So really by 1200, the time period that we're starting in, the Vikings weren't as much of an issue anymore. But this instability that was created did have long-term effects for Europe, which we'll talk about. The Crusades were a series of invasions of the Middle East, territory that at this time was held by Muslims, by European Christians attempting to recapture the Holy Land. So the basic example or reason why the Crusades happened is that Europeans wanted to take back the Middle East from Muslim forces. It actually started with the Byzantine Emperor, who's the head of Eastern Europe at this time, was being invaded by Muslim armies and asked the Christian West for help with that. And so Pope Urban II officially called for the First Crusade. Europeans had many reasons they wanted to go on crusades. In general, religion and Christianity was extremely important to people in Europe at this time, and so the idea that you're going to go like defend your religion is something that appealed to people. It also provided adventure and a reason to travel. Some people hoped to become wealthy or famous by going on the Crusades, and it also provided an outlet for knights, who are the warriors of this time period, to go and fight. So take a look at this map for a minute. This shows you the lines represent the first 4 Crusades. So the Crusades were actually a series of events. There were even more than 4. There were many over time. But you can see there's a general direction from Western Europe, people going over to the Middle East and trying to take back this territory. At this time, this was under the Muslim Caliphate of the Abbasids. So what are the effects? Cultural diffusion. Remember when we studied the Middle East and we studied all of the achievements of Muslim scholars in math and science and astronomy and medicine and literature and all of those things? Also remember, they're the ones that preserved the works of the Greeks and Romans. So remember, they translated people like Aristotle into Arabic and built on his knowledge. Europe at this time, they're just really trying to survive. There's not a whole lot of innovation happening in Europe. So by coming over here and invading, a side benefit for Europeans is they were exposed to all of that amazing knowledge coming out of the Muslim world. It also increased trade between Europe and the Middle East, and Italy especially benefited. So if you look at the map, you can see Italy is really right in the center of the Crusade routes. So if you're traveling from Europe to the Middle East on a crusade, Italy is kind of a natural stopover point where you would stop and get supplies and food and continue on your journey. And so that really invigorated the Italian economy. It also intensified animosity between Christians and Muslims. So even though the Christians are really benefiting in a lot of ways here, they're attacking the Muslim empires, and so it increases hostility between those two groups. So here's a famous quote: "The Crusades were one of history's most successful failures." So the Crusades did not achieve their original goals. The Christians were never able to fully take over the Middle East. At times, on certain crusades, they took over like little parts of it for a little while, but the Muslims at this point in the Middle East were much more advanced in a lot of ways, and so the Christians were not able to overtake them in the Middle East. But it can be considered a success for Western Europe in the sense that Western Europe got all of that knowledge and trade benefit from the Middle East. So the Christians definitely benefited more through gaining knowledge from the Muslim world and trade opportunities. The Muslims, I would say, benefited less because the Christians just didn't really have a lot of knowledge to share with them. It was kind of a one-sided exchange. The next thing to know about the Middle Ages is how important the Catholic Church was in Western Europe. So people at this time were very, very religious. And for most people, their number one goal in life was to go to heaven. And we have to kind of put ourselves in their shoes with this, that they lived very harsh lives. They were just really trying to survive in Western Europe at this time. And so this hope of a good afterlife and going to heaven was very, very important to people. And so the church did things that made people feel like they would go to heaven, things like administering sacraments, like communion and confession and baptism. The clergy also often served the king as vassals, and we'll talk about a vassal in a minute. All Christians were also supposed to give 10% of their earnings to the church, called a tithe. The church was the largest landowner in Europe. The Pope at this time ruled his own kingdom in Italy called the Papal States, so he was a religious and political leader. So all of those are reasons why the Catholic Church was so powerful. People felt like they controlled their future and their afterlife. They controlled a lot of money and a lot of land. And monasticism continued to be important. Remember, Christianity and Buddhism are the two major religions that offer a monastic life. Monasticism in the Catholic Church offered an important opportunity for women, because at this time, if you're a woman, really your only options are to be a wife or a mother. And so being a nun offered like a different type of life for a woman if she doesn't want to become a wife and a mother. Monasteries were also really important to the community in Western Europe. So monasteries, we've talked before about how monasteries often had schools attached, but even if they didn't, monks were usually the only educated people in the society, because monks were trained to read and write, and a major thing that monks did during this time is they preserved knowledge, because they're the ones that produced books and manuscripts. So we learned about movable type in China and how printing was invented in China. That had not spread to Europe by this time. So in Europe, books were made by hand writing them out, like you see the guy in the picture doing. And so monasteries became the one major place in Europe where they were actually preserving knowledge. Schools and universities were often also run by the church, so if you were able to get an education, it usually was through the church. Now, even though we talk a lot about Christianity here, it is important to remember that there were other religions in Europe at the time. So remember we talked about Al-Andalus and Muslim Spain, which is in orange here. So remember that Spain had its own caliphate that was ruled by Muslims at this time. So Islam, although not widespread in Europe, pretty much controls the Iberian Peninsula, and there's a lot of important learning and scholarship going on there. And then the other important religion in Europe is Judaism. So remember way back in the Roman Empire, we talked about the Jewish diaspora and how the Jews were persecuted, and so they spread out throughout the world. This map shows, it's actually a map of the diasporic communities. And so the blue represents areas where Jews were concentrated. So in addition to other parts of the world, there were Jews all throughout Europe living in their own communities. And so that was another significant religion in Europe. So let's talk about feudalism and manorialism. Remember at the beginning I said that the invasions and lack of central authority made Europe very dangerous, and people had a lot of anxiety about invasions and just what's going to happen to them without a strong central government. And so they developed a system to deal with this. People started to turn to their local aristocracy for protection because the local aristocracy or wealthy usually live in large homes or castles, and usually they have walls built around their estate for protection. And so when you're looking around and thinking, where can I be protected if there's no central government, that might be an obvious place. And so two new systems, so it developed first and foremost for protection. Two new systems developed. Feudalism is a political system that governed the relationship between a king and his lords and knights. Then there's manorialism, which is a new economic system, and it governs the relationship between a lord and his peasants. And if you look at the diagram here, there's four basic levels of society in feudal Europe. We have the king, the lords, the knights, who are the warriors. The lords are just the wealthy landowners. And then at the bottom, we have peasants, who we also call serfs, which I'll explain in a minute. So vassal is an important term associated with feudalism. A vassal is someone who serves a lord or a king. So a vassal is just somebody who serves somebody above them. And vassals made an oath of loyalty to the lord or king they served, and they sort of had a contract with that person. The contract might be written, but it might also just be kind of understood, like these are your responsibilities. So the vassal is supposed to give the lord his military service, serve as an advisor, give financial payments, and give loyalty. So he's going to serve the king or the lord like whenever he's called on. And then the lord to the vassal is supposed to defend the vassal. And the really important thing is that the lord is going to give the vassal land, which is also called a fief, in exchange for his service. Vassals at this time were also supposed to have a code that they lived by, which is called the Code of Chivalry. So this is like behavioral things that they're supposed to do, kind of governing the morality of how lords and knights are supposed to act. So manorialism. The vassal, remember, is given by the king or the lord a fief, which is an estate or piece of land. So they usually would build a large estate with a castle or a large home called a manor. So that's where we get manorialism from, because the large house on the estate was called a manor home. And so remember that the people who don't have a manor, the poor people, now need protection. And so peasants moved on to the manor land and sought protection from the lord. The lord would allow them to live there in exchange for their work. So once we start having this arrangement where the peasants live on the lord's land and they have certain restrictions and kind of like a contract with the lord to be able to live there, we start to call them serfs. So a serf is someone who is legally tied to the land. Like they have some kind of arrangement with the lord for them to live there, but in exchange, they kind of give up some of their freedom. And so the serf has to provide labor to the lord, they have to pay rent, and they also have to pay for certain services from the lord because the lord owns everything. And by 800 CE, about 60% of the peasants in Europe were serfs. This diagram, I want you to look at this for a moment. gives a really good picture of manorialism, because manorialism is really all about the manor being self-sufficient. Because remember, it's dangerous out there outside of the manor, and so people don't really want to have to go out to get things that they need. They want everything to be right where they need it. And so a manor became almost like its own little village on the Lord's land that had everything that people need. So if you look here, for example, you can see the manor house, the large house where the Lord and his family lived. You can see a bunch of little houses where the serfs would live. You can see a church. You can see grazing land and farmland. You can see a water wheel, which probably fueled a mill to grind grain into flour. They have a blacksmith shop. They have everything they need right here. So a manor is supposed to be self-sufficient. They're not supposed to have to really go outside of the manor to get things that they need. And again, that's because they're living in a very dangerous time. And so let me talk a little bit more about what the serfs had to do. So half of the Lord's land was for the serfs, but they don't own that land. And when you don't own something and you use it, you have to pay rent. So half the week the serfs would spend working, farming the Lord's land for the Lord. The other half of the week, they would be able to farm their land, which they rented from the Lord, to be able to feed their families. The Lord also had restrictions over the serfs. They couldn't leave the manor without his permission. They couldn't marry without his permission. They also had to pay to use the different services that the Lord provided. Like if they need to use the mill or they need to use the blacksmith shop, they have to pay for that. And so we might kind of ask ourselves, why would anybody do this? But again, it's to have protection in this time that people enter into this type of contract. All right, the fifth thing to know is the Black Death. And we talked a little bit about this previously, but the Black Death is a huge outbreak of bubonic plague throughout Afro-Eurasia in the 1300s. It probably originated in Asia and was spread by the Mongols as they conquered and traded over to the Middle East. Then, from the Middle East, it spread into North Africa, and then it spread on ships into Europe from the Mediterranean northward. Probably the way that you most commonly got bubonic plague is being bitten by fleas. Fleas were carried by rats at this time, which were very common on ships and really in people's homes. We don't maybe like to think about that today, but they did not have good sanitation at this time. And so having rats and fleas around, even in your home, was very, very common. So about a third of the population of Europe died as a result of this Black Death outbreak. Serfdom decreased in Western Europe as a result. Because so many people died, there were shortages of labor, and serfs could leave the manor and kind of go like wherever they could be paid the most. So their labor was in very high demand, and that benefited them. It also decreased the power of the Catholic Church. So I said people were very, very religious. Now, say like you've prayed for your family to be saved from the Black Death, and you see a ton of people dying. And so it just caused people to kind of question their faith, like, why is this happening? Is this a punishment from God? Why isn't God stopping this? That sort of thing. It's also important to note, even though we're talking about Europe right now in this lecture, that it greatly impacted North Africa, China, and Central Asia as well. This is not something that just impacted Europe. All right, the sixth thing. So later in the Middle Ages, towns started to grow. So when we had the advent of feudalism and manorialism, a lot of people left towns and went to live on a manor, and towns were dying out. Now, by the later Middle Ages, people start to go back to towns, and towns start to be revived. So feudalism started to break down because of the Black Death. Trade had increased with the Crusades, and so more people moved to cities because those are centers of trade. The invasions mostly stopped, like the Vikings have all settled and aren't invading anymore, and so it's safer to go back to cities. A key example are the Italian city-states like Venice, which we talked about a few minutes ago. In the Crusades, they became wealthy by buying and selling things to the Crusaders. So as towns grew, trade between towns grew, and different trading leagues developed. An example in Europe is the Hanseatic League. All the dots on this map show cities in Northern Europe that joined this league, where they agreed to try to facilitate and increase trade between their different towns. And this diagram does a good job of showing you why and how and which cities fell and grew in this time period. So reasons why cities fell: invasions, disease, decline in agriculture. And you can see at the bottom some of the cities that are like the great classical cities that declined. So Rome, Athens, Alexandria, Egypt, Chang'an in China, Pataliputra, which is in the Gupta Empire. So there's reasons where at the beginning of this time period, a lot of these great cities declined. But now by the end of the time period, we have the rise of new important cities, such as Novgorod, which is in Russia, Timbuktu, Baghdad, Hangzhou, Venice in Italy, and Calicut in India. So why are all these new cities growing? And hopefully you kind of know already that a lot of these cities are centers of trade. So the end of invasions made cities more safe again. Better transportation, rise in trade. So that's really key, right? A lot of these cities we've talked about were centers of trade. More farm land came under cultivation, which led to more population increase in cities. And more people meant there was more labor, and so more labor available, and so people moved to cities who were artisans or produced different products. Along with that, with the development of trade and artisans, another thing that continued and grew in Europe are guilds. Guilds are organizations of artisans, and they form an organization to regulate their industry. So in your city, it could be a guild of all bakers, or a guild of all textile makers, or a guild of all blacksmiths. And you come together to train new people to go into your industry and become apprentices. You also regulate the industry. So they would regulate, here's how much we're going to produce. It needs to be this type of high quality. Here are the prices we're going to charge. And so it's kind of like a union of people who all do the same thing. All right, so the last thing is we've talked a lot about Western Europe and what was going on in Eastern Europe. So this map goes back to the Roman Empire. We see that Roman Empire was split. The western half collapsed, and we've been talking in the rest of the PowerPoint about what happened to the western half. The eastern half, remember, continued on. And so the area that's greenish blue here continued on from the Roman Empire and came to be called the Byzantine Empire. So here are some key characteristics of the Byzantine Empire. They kept their emperor. So while the Roman Empire was no more in Western Europe, the Byzantine Empire kept an emperor. They were also Christian, but they formed a new type of Christianity called Eastern Orthodox Christianity. They had very impressive arts and architecture. This is actually a mosaic that you see here of the Emperor Justinian. They greatly influenced Russia. So the Byzantine Empire is very close to Russia. Russia was just starting at this time and adopted a lot of Byzantine things. For example, the major religion of Russia was Eastern Orthodox Christianity. They also were a major trading center. So I put a star, a red star on the map over Constantinople. That was the capital of the Byzantine Empire. And you can see it's right near the Silk Roads, near the Mediterranean, near the Black Sea. It was a major center of trade. And then the last important thing is they were continually invaded. And we've talked about them, like I've mentioned them briefly, in relation to the Seljuk Turks and Muslim invasions. So the Byzantines, also because of their location, even though it was good for trade, it was not good for keeping their empire together because they're continually invaded throughout their history. So that is a quick look at Europe from 1200 to 1450.